Right now I had the pleasure of introducing the third panel of the day, which is called Design Innovation and Risk Mitigation Strategies from the Private Sector, a subject we don't often hear about and one I'm very eager to. First, I'm pleased to welcome our moderator, Paul McManus, Senior Lecturer of Strategy and Innovation at the Boston University School of Management. He's joined by Bryan Kopp, to his immediate left, Senior Vice President at Boston Properties. Bryan was chosen by Mayor Menino to serve on the Boston Green Ribbon Commission and co-chairs the Adaptation Working Group Steering Committee. To his left is Jason Hellendrung, a principal at Sasaki Associates. Jason's work involves reshaping cities through public infrastructure improvements, excuse me, including open space and the redevelopment of urban waterfronts. I was looking at your website last night. It was really, really impressive stuff, a lot of it. And to the left of Jason is Lindene Patton, the head of Global Hazard Product Portfolio and Business Development for CoreLogic. Lindene is a former Chief Climate Product Officer for Zurich Insurance Group, where she focused on risk assessment and product development in the light of climate change. I'm really eager to hear from you too. So I'll let Paul take the stage and lead it off.
Thank you all. I'm really excited to be here and excited to be here at this moment in time on this topic. I couldn't be more pleased to be with this group of folks here on the panel to talk about the topic. I'm not going to do much other than introduce Bryan Kopp, who's going to be our first speaker. We're going to follow the same format, 10 minutes of remarks, opening up to Q&A. This is something a little bit different. This is the private sector, talking about what's happening, where the action is, and what's going on, and the exciting programs and development that's happening. So let's dive in.
All right. Well, thank you for the honor of being here. I'm saddened by the fact that Mayor Menino, who was such a good friend of our organization, had asked me to be here, and he was so excited about this. And this is exactly the type of thing he dug so much, which was people coming together and talking and solving problems. So it's with some remorse today that we're here, but in his honor, I just think it's wonderful. We're bringing people together to talk about how to make our cities better. Let me give you a perspective on Boston Properties. Just real quickly, we own buildings, big buildings. We own the Prudential Center here in Boston. We own the John Hancock Tower in Boston, Atlantic Wharf and 100 Fed, maybe some of the buildings you know, and then most of the buildings right around Kendall Square are ours as well. So we're a large property owner, and I want to have you maybe get into our lens a little bit, which is different than probably some of the people you've heard from today, which is really we're at the ground level. We're at the practical level of people living in our buildings on a daily basis, mainly office buildings and shopping centers. But that's our lens. We've been committed, our Boston region, to sustainability for probably 9 years, and I'd say the last 6 is when we've really got it through the DNA of our organization. Resiliency fits within that strategy, but what you'll find with us is that resiliency strategy, whatever we do with that, also fits into something really practical, life safety. So we have a life safety team, and they're also the security group as well, and it's a big staff. So we've got 100 people involved in that for our portfolio here. So when we talk about resiliency, this has been a part of the real estate vernacular for a long term, but it was just called something different. So the resiliency piece that I would tell you really got exponentially hotter with my team really happened after Sandy. And it happened, and it's really a New York story for us that we refer to all the time. I sent our team down to New York City after Sandy hit, and they came back with these remarkable stories. I wanted to have best demonstrated practices, et cetera, but what they came back with was even greater, and that was stories, because stories are memorable and sticky. And my team still talks about interviewing a manager of an office building who I don't have the timeline and we don't have the time, but basically said at one point she goes down to her lobby. She's just trying to get plywood and gear and things to prepare for Sandy. And she looks down the street and there's a commotion. She sees some water in the street. Half hour later, she comes down. The water's in front of the building. A few minutes later, the water is so high that it's coming up on the side of pitcher floor-to-ceiling glass. And when she was interviewed, she said, I know I saw a fish go by. I at least saw things go by. but you can tell the situation she was in. But also what happened next was when the glass blew open, she had to rush with her immediate team up to the second and third floor to escape, but she had a team of engineers below the building. The people who take care of the building, the people who run the buildings were down below, and they had to swim to safety. Now, for those of you in my world, a lot of the engineers, 50% of my engineers all went to Mass Maritime. They tend to be, in the Northeast, nautical people and nautical engineers. And one person said, had I not had my seamanship certificate and how to escape in a situation like that, I wouldn't be here today. He literally swam to a light at a staircase. So it really hits home. The other thing that happens for us is that we're at, again, this practical state. And what we do when we train our people is try to break it down into very simple terms. So we don't even get into the science that you're talking about today, and we try to put it into what I commonly refer to. I'm from Texas. In Fort Worth, they got something called cowboy logic, okay, which is common sense. So cowboy logic would be as follows for me. I'm a history buff, and I also love biblical history. Let me fast forward. This is Hurricane, it was before they named hurricanes, 1938, for the history buffs in the world. It was also referred to as the Long Island Clipper or Long Island Express. This hurricane, my father was around to see this, right? This isn't like 200 years ago. This is the most devastating hurricane that the East Coast has ever seen. This thing just cut up the East Coast. It started in the Mojave Desert. It's the fastest moving hurricane ever, they think. It went from like Florida to Long Island in one day. It was ridiculous. This thing went through Long Island. There's still places that have never been rebuilt by this, especially in Rhode Island as well. It died in Montreal. Think of that. It's a long way in, right? And the point of all this is, this isn't some long time ago. This happened. 690 people died between Long Island and New England. This is devastating stuff. Hartford, Connecticut was underwater, believe it or not. The second highest recorded wind on planet Earth was just outside of here at Blue Hills Observatory from this hurricane. So let's go back to my previous picture. This is downtown Providence. There's other pictures. Look it up on the internet. It's fantastic photos of this stuff. People were throwing bed sheets tied together out at a Biltmore Hotel to save people as they floated by, right? So let's use some cowboy logic here. I don't need the science, and I certainly don't want to be an idiot of biblical proportion. This stuff can happen here, and it happened recently, but Sandy was a spitball compared to this particular hurricane, okay? So we live on the coast. We're a coastal city. We're just ranked by, I think it was OECD, I get my terminology wrong, as one of the top 10 cities in terms of risk. So we're there. So when we talk about this at a building level, we try to break it into very quick terms. And one of the things that's been helpful for me is I talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We all know this. Well, the chart we use internally is the Koop's hierarchy of resiliency. At the bottom, when things get bad that first week and you don't have water, electricity, or transportation, and I tell our team, that's public, that's quasi-public, let's just assume that they're not going to be there. That's not that we don't believe in these people and that they're not good partners. Let's assume it's not there. Because we've had far less things than the things we're talking about today happen where we haven't had it. We had a blackout in the Back Bay that lasted a week. We had a bombing that took out all kinds of things that we were used to. And so we focus on the top. So real quickly, here's our strategy in a nutshell that we talk about. Unlike this crowd, which is scientists and things like that, I would tell you that, and I'm no exception, real estate is the last bastion for C students. So we got to break it down into some memorable things. So our strategy is threefold. We call it Resiliency 101, and we have some fun with this, and we call it three components: Doomsday Triage, Black Swan Resiliency, and New Planet. Let me quickly go through that. Doomsday, something bad's going to happen, we got to count on it, right? Well, for the practical thing, and especially my life safety people get this the best, We have really become fond of this book called Checklist Manifesto, a locally lit author, great author, but we have really taken this to heart. And what is Checklist Manifesto? It's the importance of a checklist, right? And for us, these are the systems we use, and it's everyday stuff like this that every building should have. But I would tell you, we buy a lot of buildings. When we go into most of the buildings we acquire, they don't have any of this. And for those of you who are officed in a high-rise, I'd encourage you to talk to your property manager and go, when's the last time we had a fire evacuation? Most of the buildings we buy haven't had an evacuation in a 5-year period. First off, it's against the law, but it doesn't take place because most people in the buildings don't like doing it, so the property managers avoid it. So here's some of the things we've got cooking with the checklist. We just bought an aqua fence, and we just got the permits to use this, and it's going to be around Atlantic Wharf. We're really excited about that. Here's a picture of that aqua fence being put up a couple weeks ago. We did it in November because it's rainy and cold, and we wanted to do it when storms would hit. We also have pre-purchasing on off-site energy committed to us when the storms hit. Let's go to Black Swan theory, the second component. Under Black Swan theory, I'm a big proponent of this economist Taleb, who said, count on bad things happening, but your ability to predict it is impossible, so build robustness. And what we do with that is each year we've got about $20 million of capital expenditures that we put it back in our buildings. Now when we put it back in our buildings, I ask this question: how is this going to help us to be more resilient? That's a budget. This would be some of the things that we would be purchasing: new transformers, new switches, et cetera. The last component of our strategy is what we call a new planet, and that is having to do with new design. We want to do more holistic things in our design. This would be an example. We built a building in Weston next to a quarry. Let's use the water that's in the quarry, not only for day-to-day cooling, but also when things get really bad, our backup system goes to this versus the water system. This is a diagram here of how it works. And then 888 Boylston is a building that we're building just down the street. Everything about this building, we've got 13 to 14, call it new innovative features that are sustainable, but we also want each of those sustainable features to also have a backup for resiliency, have a second component instead of just being about sustainability, have it be something that makes us more robust for these black swan events. And last but not least, we're focused on trying to do a better job in designing and winning some awards in this zone. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think like our other speakers, it's a real honor to be here, and thank you to BU for hosting the event and for having us all here today. I want to talk a little bit about a few things as we start to look at strategies, and that is cities, people, vulnerabilities, and then the strategies. And so kind of looking at the design side of it, but most importantly, what are the cities that we live in and the people that occupy them? And so I'm with Sasaki. We're an architecture, landscape architecture, and planning and design firm. And we've been working with cities for the last couple decades in helping them reinvent their waterfronts as there's been a departure of industry and they've become places for people. We've been doing this. And what we've seen really in the last decade or so has been what we call the new era of waterfronts. And we've been working more and more like places like New Orleans after Sandy. And the exclamation point was 2008, working in Cedar Rapids. We had been hired to do a riverfront master plan. While we were there, they had their historic flood, a biblical flood that was 11 feet higher than any previous flood. We were there for our kickoff, and I was evacuated from our hotel and then spent the next 2.5 years leading their long-term recovery plan from that $6 billion disaster. And that ushered in all of these aspects of why we're doing what we're doing. And why are we doing this here in Boston? So here we are. This is Long Wharf. This was about September 11th on the spring tide. And you can see the water actually coming up over a normal high tide on a blue sky day with minimal wind, and it's actually coming over the harbor walk. And so when everybody starts talking about sea level rise in 1 to 5 feet over the next 50 to 100 years, and you add a storm surge of 5 feet or so on top of that, you can imagine the impact that we're talking about. So I need to really kind of segue that we built off of, Sea Change was an effort we did, started in March of 2013, and it really built off of the work. I'm pointing to Julie Wormser from the Boston Harbor Association, but the work that they did with preparing for the rising tide. And that report really kind of opened everybody's eyes to sea level rise in Boston. And what we did with Sea Change was when we read that report, we thought there are a lot of things that we understand the vulnerabilities, but what are the strategies of what we can do around the world? And we ultimately exhibited this at District Hall in DC. And the real idea was to bring it to the community, but what was really interesting was how people responded to it. It was a public exhibit, and hearing about people in West Roxbury talking about and saying, I'd never thought about sea level rise, but if somebody in Dorchester is flooded and out of their home or it goes underwater, then that's going to impact where I live. And so it gets into these aspects of what are the communities that we live in. So we've heard about glaciers and Boston, and this may be a little difficult, but you see across the top, this is Boston during the ice ages. And you can see in black, that is the outline of Boston. And then you can see at the bottom, starting in 1630, the founding of Boston. And a lot of those areas start to fill in to where we are today. And then we start to look at sea level rise in 2050 and 2100. You see that starting to go away. And so we've heard about these 4 storms since Sandy and how we're 20 hours away from basically being a storm like Sandy and the impact in New York. Well, another way to look at that is 5.5 hours away, and we very well could have been back to where Boston was at the end of the Ice Age. And so this is Boston, and these are sea level rise projections. And so this is looking at 2100. These are very similar. We've been working with the Boston Harbor Association on this effort to use the same data and mapping. We're communicating it in a different way, but it's the same level. You see what goes underwater and those impacts in Boston. And here you see this, we're in this building not too far from where you see Charles River on that map, and you see it underwater in the Back Bay. And the key is, what's at risk? You see here in yellow, nearly 20% of the population in Boston, almost 125,000 residents, are at risk of sea level rise and these storms and storm surge. You look collectively at residential properties in Boston and Cambridge, it's nearly $5 billion at risk. You look at commercial properties, and between Boston and the surrounding area, Cambridge, Quincy, nearly $14 billion at risk. You look at the impacts to our transportation systems, tunnels, airports, 50 subway tunnels, 11 tunnel entrances at risk. And then you look at some of our other major systems like power plants and hospitals, all major at risk. And that really led to wanting to communicate not a doom and gloom approach to the future, but really what are the opportunities? And so what are the tough questions? And there are those aspects of, do we fortify, retreat, or how do we adapt? And so we started to look at some of these strategies and catalog them and start to look at how we could help strengthen some of our buildings and protect them, how to protect our public realm, and look at some of our public spaces and landscapes and streets. And so as we start to look at those, how we could apply that catalog to all these different vulnerable areas throughout the city. And so just looking in detail at our buildings and how we could flood-proof them, dry flood-proof or wet flood-proof them, and then looking at other systems of new buildings that could be elevated or floating buildings and kind of what that represents for the future. And then as we start to look at our public spaces, looking at a system of streets that could have cisterns like Councilor Wood showed last night, or canal streets, or looking at different systems that can protect our space or be absorbent like parks. Looking at some of our coastal systems and looking at new improved public space that could be levees that could start to protect areas, or even looking at the harbor islands and how they could be strengthened to have a greater ecological function, but that could also help with mitigating storm surge. And the key here is not just looking at all of these incremental pieces, but it's been great to hear in the last couple of weeks the announcement of the Mayor's Forum, but to start looking regionally, because as has been stated before, water doesn't know any geographic boundaries. So the Charles River is bounded by Boston and Cambridge. So how we can start to look at that approach. All those strategies really led to kind of what we published in August. We co-authored with the Boston Harbor Association, Designing with Water, which looks at how to make a more resilient Boston. What are great case studies and strategies to look to for the future? And we highlight 12 great projects, but then have a great appendix as well with that. And that really leads to the work with the Living with Water competition that's just starting. I want to compare two different areas. So Boston and Sea Change is very focused on urban areas, but also want to talk about some of our coastal communities. We participated last year through the HUD Rebuild by Design program, and that was an initiative through the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force and funded through the Rockefeller Foundation. And rather than rebuilding, it was looking at innovations and resilience. So we worked with a lot of great scientists at Rutgers and also partners in engineering at Arup. And the focus was really about the Jersey Shore. That's where we zeroed in. We were one of the 10 teams. And so it was about the ecology, economy, and culture of the Jersey Shore. And what's amazing is the Jersey Shore is defined by this beach, this ribbon of sand that runs along the Atlantic coast. Yet it's created a nearly $30 billion tourism industry for New Jersey. But what that means for people, again, getting back to people, and the generations of people that have gone there over the years and brought their families, and what it means and what it will mean in the future. And so as we started to look at this and took that idea of the beach and that being the ribbon of sand, said, how can we make this more resilient? How can we strengthen and grow and diversify this tourism industry into an ecotourism industry? And what are more resilient landscapes that we could tie into? And so when we took some of these cultural icons like the pier, and everybody can remember those images of the roller coaster in Seaside Heights in the ocean, but how we could take some of those ideas and marry them and make them fall in love with one of these great ecological assets, like the Pine Barrens or other areas. And so as we went into this, we analyzed all the ecological zones. We characterized all of the East Coast and the Jersey Shore into 3 different ecological types: the inland bays, the headlands, and the barrier islands. And you can see the impacts to the state, nearly $500 million in tax revenue loss, but then you can look at the issues with the loss of ratables in these communities, and it just shows how vulnerable these areas are. And we came up with a number of strategies for each of them. So looking at Raritan Bay and the inland bays, headlands, we looked at Asbury Park, and there it was a higher and drier area, and looking at a new system of a boardwalk dune. People think of Asbury Park and the boardwalk and Bruce Springsteen, but how we could actually reimagine that as a new structural system that could support the growth of a healthy ecological dune system that could have ecological value and help to offer actual protection for the city. In contrast to the $900 million worth of sand that was redumped on the beaches of New Jersey and New York post-Sandy. So this would be something that could actually sustain itself and create that ecological value while protecting. And again, the idea was how we could do this in a manner of bringing communities together, bring them back and forth. Just to touch back on this for a second, Barrier Island, it goes underwater. And I'll welcome questions around that aspect of managed retreat. But with that, we said, this area goes underwater, Seaside Heights can't be protected, and how do we look at this to the future? And we actually started looking at new gateways to the Jersey Shore that were in inland, better protected areas that could serve as a gateway to the beaches, but also to the Pine Barrens and all the other ecological assets and resources, and looking at a way to diversify that ecotourism in a way to bring people together. So thank you. I've got on here a few of the links to a couple of the reports, Designing with Water and Sea Change. So grab those or see me afterwards, and happy to answer questions on that. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much. Very happy to be here, and I think my lens is a little different than perhaps some of the people that have spoken earlier today. I've spent my career at what I'd call the uncomfortable intersection of science, law, and risk management finance. None of those cultural communities tend to communicate very well together, and I'm educated in all 3 areas, which is worrisome to me on some days. But I hope that I can share with you what I see as a really exciting new frontier. I spent a lot of my career being told that we can't invest, or we can't analyze the kinds of risks to make better decisions in the face of climate change or in the face of other types of change in society and in the environment. And I feel that we are actually at a point in time where we have the data. The question is, are we going to have the will to exercise and use that data? And my perspective on this, if I can learn how to use, is it the red button for somebody?
The one to the right.
To the right?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that we need to think a little bit out of the box, but we have a real driver to do so. We are very motivated, and I think most people in this room understand why. Just as so I'll confirm that I am a lawyer. These are my opinions. I should also tell you that I have had the privilege to be in my current job for less than a month now. So that having just come from about 20 years in the frontline insurance industry and now finding myself in the back room to financial services, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Basically, I work now in a very large data house which supplies about 70% of the base of the backroom data that goes into the multiple listing service, as well as all of the tax boundary information that goes to major utilities for mass communication utilities and the like, has huge amounts of dedicated parcel data that is not address data, that is parcel specific location data, and is now working on and has recently acquired things like natural catastrophe modeling companies, weather projection modeling companies. My dream was to work someplace where I could work on mashups, where we could actually do and proceed with trying to answer some of those questions about, well, what if? What if this scientist is right and this one's wrong? Well, what if this one's right and that one's wrong? What is that going to mean for us in terms of our invested capital, and how? How do we make sure that we are applying appropriate risk management? I'm here to tell you that we're not there yet, but what I do want to talk about is why this is important to this kind of industry. What is it? How does this affect the insurance industry? Why does public policy matter? And from my perspective, public policy matters because this is how we organize ourselves socially. And if we want to make change in things which are probably the most impactful relative to resilience, we'd better understand how the law and statutes frame up the behavior of those people who we want to change. If we want to change the investment profile for resilience for utilities, we'd better understand what we're telling them and ordering them to do in terms of consumer price protection, because that may actually inhibit the ability in terms of the way that those decisions are evaluated to make those changes. So scientists, listen up. You are going to have to figure out, in my opinion, how to talk to economists and learn from what they've done on science, on their end of science, not the hard science, not the biology science. I mean, economics is easy, don't take that the wrong way. I mean sort of physical science versus economic science. Economists for a long period of time have dealt with the reality that there's a lot of variability in their data. There's a lot of unpredictability in their data, and a lot of it is driven by independent human decision-taking and behavior. Yet, somehow, business leaders follow what economists say. In fact, the economists generally generate deterministic data, and they say, this is what our growth is going to be. This is how we're going to earn out our capital. This is what we expect from these types of social behaviors. Funny, when you go to physical scientists, they say, well, the range is this, and our stochastic models tell us that, blah, blah, blah. Well, the problem is that we need to figure out how to communicate with apples to apples so that people who are used to making decisions in the context of communications with economists, those are the people who are controlling a lot of the money that are going to be making investments in risk management, get it and understand what you're saying and understand the consequences of one decision over another. So what's the big deal and why aren't we doing that right now? The bottom line is, in my opinion, in the risk management and capital investment context, we do not have an agreement about how to finance return rates of storms. It's that simple, okay? So why can't we just have that discussion? It seems to me that there has to be a discussion about how you deal with the same type of problem that hits the mortgage industry. How do you finance, over a long period of time, a 30-year mortgage? How do you set up a system to deal with that? We're not answering that same question with how do we deal with a change in the physical environment that's going to occur over that same 30-year period in which you have that investment profile. Okay? We have a default consequence, and that's disaster mitigation expenses. Okay? But what this failure to decide and what this sort of uncomfortable intersection results in is a circumstance where the insurance industry today is experiencing increased severity of specific types of events, a total loss of stationarity. But under circumstances where people who they insure, whether it is utilities or not, have development criteria which are based on, let's say, 1970s lookup tables for rainfall. Yet, on the other side of the house, in the planning department in the same city or the same locality, they have a climate change action plan. So tell me which is right. Okay, so the procurement people for the utility are saying, I can't deal with climate change. The people on the other side of the planning are saying, but you have to, because we have a climate change action plan. But no one is dealing with the Independent Utility Commission that procures the change in that utility that would allow the resilience. So I think we have to deal with those. So how do you do with that? In my opinion, you have to deal with data. Okay, so to date, everybody said, oh, we don't have enough data. I don't necessarily agree. I think what we have is tons of data. We just haven't come with an agreement on how to analyze it. And we haven't come with productive partnerships that allow people to bridge the gap between all data, the position that says all data should be free, and then the other position that says we should be highly compensated for the data that we have at a particular rate. Somewhere in between those two answers is the right answer. Nothing comes for free, but people do lots of things in partnership. And I think we now have a lot of data, some of which is coming for free. And I'm sorry, I meant to tell you that this is a recent report that was released this summer out of an innovative partnership with a couple of multilateral groups, which are cited, that you might want to look at because it's looking at trending and pointing up some very interesting issues associated with data management in the context of disaster implications. The reason I like this report is it tries to not only cut the data in telling you what we know over a long period of time, think like climate change time, and what we know if you were to break that down into, let's say, investment cohort terms, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And the funny thing is, if you were sitting in the 1970s and making a decision, you would not think that the source of disasters that cause loss in the same space are the same ones that you think 20 years later, or if you looked over a 30-year period. So there's something to be learned about how we're managing data, whether we're looking at deaths, physical property hazards, or economic damages by decade, because they are driven, if you get them in too small of a piece, by different decision taking. So you better align those capital investments in a way that reflects that long-term view. But the other thing that's kind of interesting to me is that has been an assumption when I started in my career, the insurance industry was going to really solve this problem because after all, they were the ones that were most at risk. I'm here to tell you, trick or treat, that's not actually true. Okay, and it's not just me. It's a bunch of economists who have done some analytics, and I've extracted two of those here, two sets of the data here for discussion. One is some extraction from Munich Re-loss data, which shows that over time, as loss experience has gone up in society globally, the percentage of that, which has been assumed by the insurance industry, has decreased, not increased. Now, there are multiple confounders that are occurring there, which include location of growth, but it also includes an exercise of knowledge on the part of the insurance industry in terms of underwriting and demanding resilience as a condition of putting up risk capital. And when local societies refuse to invest, insurers generally say, not my capital. Okay, but what happens then? What happens then, I say so authoritatively, is that you have this type of diagram, which is an extraction from the US data on disaster recovery, which says that if you go over a couple of decades, what you find is that historically in the US, through self-help and other things, about 30% of disaster aid was paid for by the federal government, and 70% was realized and paid for through self-help and through private insurance. Today, that statistic is absolutely inverted. So if you want to know who's paying for disasters, look to your left, look to your right, look to your feet. And I would tell you that this is not a joke. Most of these things are funded by off-budget, not within the controlled budget, in Congress funds. Okay, and if you do the projections using, as I suggested, the same protocols that economists use to measure other things like unpaid for, unbudgeted Social Security, funny thing, you end up in the same number. This is a very serious economic problem. So let me tell you that I have a very short period of time to tell you where I think this is going. We do have a challenge, uncontrolled, accretive, off-budget liability growth. But we have lots of data. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. And what is that? okay, and this is I have about 4 slides to go through, sorry, that tell you where I think this is cool. There's more study than action going on now, but we're right at a precipice of a change. DOT is measuring resilience metrics for specific applications in utilities. Anybody who wants to participate in those workshops, it's all being done at the national labs and through DOE headquarters. I encourage you to get involved in setting up metrics based on how electric utilities will determine whether they are resilient or not. And I would suggest to you that those discussions range from things like time to return to delivering power to, gee, did we mount a camera on a fence? I have a personal opinion about whether one of those determines whether you're resilient or not, but that's my opinion. In the end, this is a political process that determines that outcome. NIST is working on resilience metrics. NIBS is updating its Multi-Hazard Mitigation Council report. And the Actuarial Climate Risk Index has been produced by the Casualty and Actuarial Society. NARUC is in definitive discussions about utility measurement, which is not directly connected to the DOE work, which it might benefit from. And there are lots of commercial-driven applications that are beginning to take advantage of data mashups. I've highlighted 2 on this page in which post-disaster, contractors now, based on data that exists, can use an app, plug in the address or the parcel location, and come up with a direct estimate of replacement cost value for roofs without physically visiting the site. Okay. Now that is pretty cool. And these are high quality data. They cross-check imagery data. It's a very interesting concept. And there are more than one. There are a couple of competitors out there who do this, but that is super cool. There are predictive models now, which are as storms come near, so in very near-term disaster resilience estimations, are providing location indications about where wind is going to hit. So local asset managers can make very quick decisions about where to put in specific structured solutions and engineering solutions to protect facilities. Now, let's hope this works. Wind modeling, this is the wind modeling that goes on. You can tell where the wind's going to come, where all the predictive models say it is, and then you can make a decision and you can truth check whether what you did worked or not, because all this data is taken in pieces. But where is this all taking you? My company's vision, and there are other people in this room who share that, is we're trying to go, instead of going from 200-meter models and making guesses about what's going to hit where and making capital bets on that, we're trying to go back from a complete view from parcel point, up to portfolio. And I think we find our position today at a point where if we collaborate from government data, from privately managed data, we can get there. And people have got to do the testing, and that's why I'm excited to be here, because I think we're closer to a much better solution.
Wow. We covered an awful lot of ground there. There has to be a question or two in the audience. While you're thinking about that, I would like to put Jason and Bryan on the spot a little bit and ask for some response to what Lindene just presented in terms of opportunity and challenges. We had a very animated conversation during our prep call, and I think that sharing some of those perspectives on from your own point of view would be valuable.
Both presentations were just excellent and so on spot with, call it my little world of real estate, but your presentation on, call it the big data part, has been a frustration of mine. So when we go to get insurance, I don't get cheaper insurance because I'm prepared. And I find that mind-boggling that the competitor next door to me who's doing nothing gets the same insurance pricing that I get. Frustrating. So I think it was encouraging to hear what you're talking about. Jason, your holistic approaches is where we're finding great solutions in our buildings and the projects we're doing. And we used to look at it more artificially, like cement wall here. Now we're looking at it more like let's work with nature. And that's something I was talking to John Cleveland about earlier. So,
Well, I'll kind of deflect that first question because half the time I don't understand what Lindene's talking about. I'm too much on the design and planning and engineering side, and there's way too much finance and insurance. I say that half kidding, but I think actually to Bryan's point though, the designing with water report, we organize that around 5 principles. The top 2, I think, first was resilience and how do you bounce back more quickly. Second was where the co-benefits. So it's not just about infrastructure to protect from sea level rise or storms, but how can you tie that to economic development, community development, neighborhood development? And so our work in Cedar Rapids, we had a river walk that during a flood, you could install a flood wall. And so it was something that could help support neighborhoods and the downtown, but could also protect the city during a flood. Seriously, to Lindene's question, it's challenging. I've been working at a lot of neighborhood scale, I guess, in areas in Westchester, some of the counties in New Jersey, Nassau County as well. And at the residential scale, there's a real challenge in the rebuilding. When you look at areas that are trying to rebuild post-Sandy and Irene, there's a real struggle to navigate through the FEMA, the HUD funding, the state programs that get organized, private insurance, and all of that. I kind of queued it up and welcomed that question around managed retreat. In Cedar Rapids, there are 5,500 homes flooded, many of them in the 100-year floodplain. Because of property values there, we actually did a voluntary acquisition program where 1,400 homes were purchased and was turned into 220-acre greenway, where we restored wetlands along rivers' edges and created open space. But that's in a system where you've got an average home price of $79,000. You try to apply that in the Jersey Shore or Long Island or areas on Long Island or Long Island Sound where you've got homes that are $600, $800, $1 million each. You can't do a voluntary acquisition program like that. So it's a real challenge of how do you adapt and protect communities when the time is ticking and you either have to rebuild or you have to buy out and answers don't come quick.
Great, thanks for being put on the spot like that. Now I've given you a little bit of after lunch time to prepare questions. I see at least a hand right over here. Let's start on the right-hand side.
Hi there. My name's Ann Wapel. I used to work at NOAA, and I was on the National Climate Assessment with Lindene and Tony, so that was a great pleasure. And now work for a group called Second Nature, which is based in Boston. One of the things that we're looking at from that experience with the National Climate Assessment in the federal space, as well as now working with over 680 universities and colleges through my current role, is exactly this question of sharing of data. It seems like right now one of the big barriers in making rapid and consolidated progress along the resilience trajectory is how we learn from each other. And if we don't have a platform through which we can connect all of the great case studies and information that we're gathering from the private sector, universities, research, building management, all kinds of different aspects, then we're going to be limited in that. So I'd be really interested to hear from people who work at the city scale as well as who work at the building scale and so on as to, what appetite there is for really co-building this platform where we can start to really figure out the particular bits of information that are useful to share across all of these different applications, and we can start to build a more coherent picture of how we're doing, what decisions are good, what are less successful.
I can speak from the micro level, call it at the street level. One of the things that's shocked me this last 24 months is that the real estate industry through associations have been really interested in things we're doing on resiliency. And I'll give you one, the aqua fence that you saw, and it's the first aqua fence in Boston. It was first permitted, and Brian Sweat was instrumental in that. We've had just a ton of people. Every time we throw a seminar on this, a ton of real estate people show up. And it really, really surprised me. A tremendous amount. So I think the real estate associations are starting to focus on resiliency, and people are responding to it. So at the local level, there's a lot of sharing going on with, so call it the tactical things.
Yeah, I would say that, there is in the context of NatCat modeling, there was a collaboration thrown up in the UK called OASIS, or it's really in the EU. Whether that's going to move from what it has, which is a kernel design, which is the idea that people can put stuff in, you have to basically get people to agree that they're going to put valuable data assets into a shared platform. And I don't think anybody's figured out how to come up with that partnership model that people believe that what they put in is what they're going to get out. And I think that is a challenge that people are going to need to rise to. And that's one of the things that I'm charged with actually in my job, looking at is how do we figure that out in a way that we can still be a private business, but at the same time can incentivize that information sharing. Because no one can afford to do all of the analytics for the whole world. So the question is, what piece can you afford to do? And if you throw that into a pot, what do you get back in terms of learning from it? And I think that there is the data there. So I think it's going to take pieces, and it's going to be collaboration that does it.
Terrific, thank you. Jason, comment or not?
I think a lot of the data's there. I think there's a lot of great work being done at a local level. You look locally at the work at the Green Ribbon Commission, preparing for the rising tide, designing with water, the work that ULI has been doing, the work that NAOP's been doing. There's a lot that's out there. There's other studies that are going on. It's kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of great resource from NOAA and others. I think the challenge is that there hasn't been enough of clarity when you look at the confusion that's come out of our congressional delegation in D.C. when there's been no clarity really from that standpoint of really setting a clear focus on it. There's too much debate and not enough focus on what is really reality.
Thank you. Question right here. Yep.
Question for Lindene. I, like you, also thought that if anybody would have the long-term view on this problem, it'd be the insurance industry. And about, 15 years ago, I was working on some climate change paper or something. I went around and I talked to a lot of people in the insurance industry and asked them that question. And then I also said, well, it seems simple. You guys understand the risk. You should be raising your rates in correlation with the increased risk. Why doesn't that happen? And they said, every one of them to the person, what you don't understand is the politics of this. That in every state in this nation is a political appointee called an insurance commissioner. And for us to raise rates, we have to go to that insurance commissioner, and there is no politically appointed insurance commissioner in the United States who is going to allow us to raise rates more than a couple of percentage points, and we're stuck. How do we deal with that problem?
If I could answer that question and could say definitively how to deal with that problem, trust me, I wouldn't have to work. But the reality is that your observation is correct, but it's I would say there are a couple more things that are important in this consideration. The financial instrument of insurance tends to be a one-year term instrument. It is non-mandatory with some exceptions, and given the recent experience with healthcare, most insurers are terrified of talking about mandatory property coverage. But so the pooling of insurance, whether it's commercial or personal lines, is complicated because it is a voluntary decision, which is largely driven based on debt. So you get some influence if you have a mortgage, right? But the fact that we're trying to solve a problem, kind of like a mortgage term, right, that is multi-decadal in nature with an instrument that's 1 year and would change year over year is a challenge. There are some people that have looked at a solution which was multi-year, but it's a problem because of the regulatory system where if you wanted to be able to trade an instrument, then that instrument needs to reflect the risk that changes over time. And so if you said, I'm going to sign a 30-year insurance contract, most of the insurers say, well, no thanks for that, because they know that the risk is going to increase and they're worried about, will they get that rate? This is a complicated environment, and I think that one of the things I mentioned on a complicated political environment, one of the things I mentioned quickly on the slide was the Actuarial Climate Risk Index. This may inform regulators to the extent that it may it does make some recommendations, and there may be other developments in this area about appropriate pooling for multi-decadal return rate risks. And that is something that the finance industry just has not been willing, I don't know if it's willing or able or both, because when you talk about something that's political, in addition to being something that's a finance structure, it's complicated. So I think the forefront of this, in my opinion, is trying to make sure, as I said before, that atmospheric and biologic scientists learn to communicate information in a manner that lines up with how the economists communicate, so we can talk to the finance people. And if we can come to some commonality of communication, we may be able to come to an agreement. Because right now, when you come in and talk about this wide range of uncertainty, the immediate response of most of the economists and most of the financiers is, well, that's not real, because you can't tell me it's real, so I'm not going to bet on it. And so we need to come up with that. We need to drive towards that, but that will require tremendous collaboration between the science, the biologic and atmospheric science community, and finance and economists. And we're not there yet. We don't even have a platform for that discussion right now. But I'm hoping to throw a little stick in that spoke with some of the mashup data that we're working on. We'll see.
Keep showing the slide about the off-balance sheet liability, and I think you'll get some attention.
That was audited by GAO, by the way, and it's still it's a very hidden piece of research. Although it's in the record.
Can I look for a question on the harbor side of the room?
Yeah.
Nothing? Other question, right here in front, Dennis. Yes, we're recording everything you say, Dennis.
Dennis Carlberg, Sustainability Director here at BU. I think Bryan and Jason, this is directed mostly to you because I'm concerned about our built environment. And the more we talk about resilience and the more we talk about it on a property by property basis, the more I worry about the discontinuity we have in our cities. And what makes our cities vibrant is those interconnections, that ability to walk and be a part of the community. And I worry about how we approach this. I mean, now we have sort of the time to plan and prepare for this. And I want to think about together how we can be mindful of that as we think about this and as we develop strategies for addressing it.
I'm a little bit biased because I'm on the Green Ribbon Council, which is just an honor to serve on, but I think Boston has a huge competitive advantage, and I just love this group. The GRC has just taken a leadership role, and the dialogue across all industries, institutions has just been amazing. We got a board meeting next Monday, and I'm actually looking really forward to it, right? It's unusual for serving on something on this. But the dialogue has been just tremendous with everybody sharing information between hospitals, institutions, et cetera, and then the private sector. But I think you're spot on with your concern. The hierarchy of needs that I have, there tends to be always an outcry for, okay, you building owners in the private sector, you need to build a certain way. Well, before you get to the buildings, there's a whole lot of other things there. Transportation, energy, and water, and just the basics. And we need a strategy on all those, and we need them all together. It's a real interesting thing, and I think it only can be solved based on, maybe it's, again, I'm biased, because you have a great vehicle with the GRC, and I think every city should have something like this. But I'm really encouraged by that particular vehicle.
Other responses? Jason?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's Hubert Murray who's said it a couple times, and he's talked about the central artery and the time to implement that when you look at that over a couple decade horizon. And if we were to contemplate something like Venice's example with the tidal barrier and a 5 billion euro price tag or whatever it may be, what's the timeline that would take? Very likely a couple decades at a minimum, if it were even funded. And I think that gets you this question of what do you do in the interim? We've been really lucky to dodge a few of these bullets, and people privately need to start taking care of what they have. The other challenge I think that you raise is our public realm and what are the opportunities there. And I think there are great opportunities to do that, but it requires a major focus on investment. And where is that? Where is an infrastructure bank or something akin to that that's going to take on that challenge? I think kind of to Lindene, I get lost in the insurance of insuring assets, but one of the things that we tried to do in Cedar Rapids, we based it a little bit on what folks did in Grand Forks after their Red River flooding in 97, is how can you self-finance? And it's difficult when you're looking at federal programs when you try to fund things. And we talk about HUD dollars because they're more flexible than other programs, but it still has a lot of red tape associated with it. But what I think the great opportunity is, what are different funding mechanisms to explore to start making some of these investments in the future? Because when we take these aggregated assets and risk, and you can talk about whatever it is, $19 billion in Boston, greater Boston. When you take that, $5 billion doesn't sound so bad. And so how do we start to do that? But what's that mechanism? And when we were in Cedar Rapids, we were looking at taking all these assets and saying, if we take this, how can we self-finance this? And if these people have to spend X amount of money in insurance, how about if we actually implement some of these infrastructures to help protect these homes in a lot of different ways? And instead of investing in all that, invest in a unified protection plan. We may not get federal money for it, but we could actually probably do it. And instead of someone paying $1,000 in insurance, they could pay $500, and we could actually assess for that difference. And there are a lot of people that are really interested in it. So, I mean, I think these mechanisms of a new form of funding and a way of doing it, I think that's the future. It just needs to be figured out with federal, state, and local money.
Yeah, this is actually a really interesting point that I think results in the chart that I showed. The public policies, which include risk management finance and disaster finance programs that were put in place in the U.S. on a national basis, and in many cases on a state basis, were put in place when we were largely a rural population. They reflect their finance structure in that manner. They reflect the ability, or they have an implied assumption that people can self-help, that they might own a tractor, or they can move, sandbags, or whatever it is. Trust me, people who live in a condo in Boston or New York, they just don't have this stuff, right? So I think, to your point, there is a rethink that needs to be done about what is appropriate policy in that context, and that is not a dialogue that has even begun in the crumbs, So I think it is it's a tough place, but there does need to be a discussion about what is the appropriate way to fund this kind of risk management issue when your population has shifted from being primarily rural to being primarily urban. Because the demands are quite different. And I think that the modeling for costs for urban environments has not kept up with the modeling for costs that was developed in rural environments. We know quite well what those costs are. We do not, and Sandy, bore that out in spades. People had not done, especially subsurface cost estimations for impacts, short-term and business interruption impacts, and then assumptions about, if your goal was to get something back up and running really quick, what do we know about what happens to the long-term stability of something that you repair that's had, 3 weeks worth of saltwater exposure? So I think that this is a public policy and finance issue in some ways, as well as a local engineering issue.
Great. I think, unfortunately, we're at time, I believe. And I'd like to call this session to a close, and want to thank our panelists one last time here for an invigorating conversation.